when it comes to those early years in a startup, speed is your weapon. And I think that can sometimes be a double-edged sword because you think you have to move so fast, decide so fast, you don't feel like you have the time to experiment. If you don't experiment and understand what's really working, and then you go down a path and it ends up failing, you could have pivoted and you could have made a better decision actually a lot sooner. As soon as you have employees lose the sense of trust of what is our overall goal here, that's when you start to harvest a culture of what am I actually contributing to. When you start small and then all of a sudden triple your employee size in 6 months, you want to still keep that startup culture. And the biggest thing that I think contributes to a startup culture, it's not ping pong, it's not snacks, and it's not a cool office. It is that everyone feels like they're contributing to the success of the organization at the time. I guess the biggest lesson, especially in a startup culture, is
welcome to the Marketing Masters podcast, where we interview CMOs and VPs of marketing in tech to help give you an inside look at what other tech marketing execs are up to and to see what's working these days in marketing. I'm your host, Lee Cooper. I'm co-founder and CEO of Cooper. We're an SEO marketing agency that helps tech companies grow their organic search traffic. And today I'm joined by Kirsten Kalsky, CMO of Ohanafy. Ohanafy is the #1 AI-powered CRM and sales platform for distributors. Think food and beverage, for example. Today we're discussing a lot of different things for early stage seed startups with some great insights into things like the value of mentorship in personal career development and the development of your people. The early stage marketing, especially in event marketing, demand gen, lead scoring, thought leadership, ABM, that kind of stuff. The challenge of marketing on a startup budget, especially for those of you who are pre-Series A, the approach of just ruthless prioritization, the value of testing, experimenting, and measuring your ROI everywhere you go. A little bit on Kirsten's view of the layer cake of marketing instead of maybe the traditional marketing funnel that you might be used to, and then cultivating a startup leadership culture of experimentation, as well as building a strong foundation of internal alignment before you scale and strategically building trust and becoming an authority in your space. If you're pre-Series A or you're interested in any of these things, then you won't want to miss this episode. Let's hop into it. Kirsten, welcome to the show.
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I guess really quickly, just so that, people know where you're coming from and they know a little bit about you and that sort of thing. Maybe you can sort of introduce yourself and where did you come from originally and how did you make it into marketing?
Yeah, so originally I studied digital design. At the time, it was a very new program. I went to UNCW, which is in North Carolina, school here in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I paired that with PR and marketing. So I came out kind of double majored in that sense, knowing I wanted to get into the design side. And quickly out of college, I landed a job at a tech startup here in town that was focused in fintech called Encino, and started my career there. And it just quickly expanded from that point.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you're at Encino, a little bit about, what kind of marketing you were doing, sort of the audiences you were targeting, just kind of what were all the things that you were doing there?
Yeah, so when I joined, the marketing team had 4 people, and I really came in to help manage our website, all of our graphic content, our, think about from presentations to anything that the brand touched. And then being in a startup world, as you know, you constantly are wearing different hats and juggling different tasks. So I quickly expanded out of just design. Because I was managing our website, it naturally flowed over into SEO and SEM, something that we weren't totally focused on at the time. Because Encino, the technology it was providing was truly the first one in its space. So our organic growth online was happening without having a large budget behind it. But I kind of took hold of that, seeing it was an area that we were eventually going to really need to invest in. So I would go home at night and, get my Google certifications and work on all of that and kind of add that into my tool belt, in addition to being a designer as well as our website manager.
Yeah. So it sounds like a little bit everything digital, a little bit everything web, kind of jack of all trades. I guess Jill of all trades might be more appropriate.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm curious, just like really quickly, if there's any like one major takeaway you had from Encino, or anything, just like one big lesson that you kind of took from there, or just everything.
I mean, I guess the biggest lesson, especially in a startup culture, is that it's just in constant change. And if anyone, has been in that environment or is looking to be in that environment, it's something you need to be very comfortable with. I always like to say respond, don't react. So you might be in a tough meeting where all of a sudden you're expanding into new markets, you're changing your ICP, you're evolving your product offering, and you think about marketing being the tip of the spear in terms of getting that awareness out there and feeling the pressure of making sure we're representing it correctly and not always constantly changing messaging. So there's that ability to be flexible, but also understand how to remain consistent from, a very, the best way to explain it is like you have to put the best foot forward for the company when you're trying to break into a new space. So being able to really understand what change is going on and what actually needs to be reflected publicly for the brand and for the company. And that was something that was definitely a lesson that I've learned over time and taken into like my job now. Whereas as a startup, you're constantly changing your ICP or you're evolving it and you're evolving your messaging as you're finding your niche and gaining more customers and making sure that you're able to be flexible enough within the marketing realm to support that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a tough issue where, everyone tells you that brand is all about consistency. And yet at a startup, I mean, there is basically nothing that is consistent, which is, it's a good thing at that stage that, like you're iterating on things and moving quickly. But it does make the whole brand consistency thing very, very, difficult. But it sounds like you kind of took that lesson from Encino and then you moved it on over to Ohanafy. I'm curious, like sort of a little bit of the story there on moving to Ohanafy and sort of the where you are now.
Yeah, so I would say one of the biggest pieces to this is having a very solid mentor throughout my entire career. So the gentleman I worked for that was the CMO at Encino, as he left and exited that company, we remained very close in touch because he helped me really grow my career and he really pushed me into these areas that I was uncomfortable with. And I remember when I was, in those beginning stages at Encino, he would always tell me one day I was going to be a CMO. And I'm like, yeah, okay, Jonathan, like maybe, but that's so far off into the future. Anyways, fast forward, the startup ecosystem here in Wilmington is quite small in a sense, so everyone kind of knows what's going on. And he approached me at one point and saying, "Hey, this great new startup. I really like what they're doing. I'm super passionate about it. I really think this is something you need to look into because they need someone to come head up marketing." So that is kind of what pulled me into this. The second thing being is both Encino and now Ohanafy, they're Salesforce built companies. So that means that they have built products on top of the Salesforce platform. So we are a Salesforce partner, and understanding the complexity of that relationship as well as selling and marketing a product that is part of the Salesforce ecosystem is quite it's an amazing opportunity to be part of that ecosystem and to really build your own brand off of it. But so having that experience with Encino, I think really helped me navigate the jump into now where I'm at Ohanafy.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. It's also great for me to hear personally on the whole, like the whole mentoring front, because I just feel like everyone I've ever talked to who became an A player, they almost always say like, "Oh, I had a great manager, I had a great mentor," something like that. And then when I got into management, for me, I feel like the most rewarding aspects was just sort of like trying to help people get to their next level. And so it's very much a recurring theme, the whole mentoring aspect of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just, I felt like it was nice to have someone help me, guide my career and make those decisions of like what I should focus in based off my skill sets. Because sometimes you don't realize the skill set you have and how you can apply it. So a lot of my experience in marketing obviously has been on the digital side. So coming into Ohanafy, there was really a need for more of that marketing background rather than your more traditional events and PR and content. We obviously do all of them, but I think that the leadership team here at Ohanafy really saw the need to do things like demand gen, SEM, and all these things a little bit sooner on within a marketing organizations. Whereas I saw typically they didn't kind of invest into that until later on, a few years down the road when the brand and all of that kind of strategy was already very established. So I think because I came from that background, it made me a really solid fit for Ohanafy. And my mentor really helped pull that out of me and recognize, like, this is your strong suit. This is what you need to start building your career in. Because I think there's a couple different ways someone can come into a CMO role, right? Like, let's be real. I'm a very young CMO and we're at a startup here. And I could have probably stayed in a larger corporation and continued to gain all of my experience in all the different areas of marketing, or a scenario like this, where what I was doing and already building a career on was a really good fit to test out and, see if I could handle like a larger role like a CMO, but at a smaller tech startup. So,
yeah. Yeah. I'm curious about the new startup, a little bit about, Ohanafy, what you guys are doing, who's your audience, that sort of thing. Just give people a quick intro on what is Ohanafy up to.
Yeah, so like I said, we're built on Salesforce, so naturally out of the box capabilities, very strong tools in terms of CRM and a sales platform. But we found that there was a really huge gap and white space within the distribution space. We originally started the company selling into alcohol producers. So think about distilleries, wineries, breweries. And then we quickly evolved from that, seeing that, there's kind of a 3-tier system within alcohol space in the US where you have the ones that make it, you have the ones that distribute it, and then you have the retailers that sell it. That middle tier, the distributors, they cannot be bypassed, right? When it comes to selling alcohol, it has to get onto a third-party truck to make it to the retailers. And they did not have any updated tech opportunity, like options within the industry. Our main competitors have been around since the 90s. And Salesforce has not broken into that space entirely in terms of just focusing on that distribution network. So we kind of naturally pulled into that space after starting the company within alcohol production space. So now our ICP is really on alcohol distributors. But that doesn't mean, I think, within the next 5 years, I see us being the number one CRM and sales platform for any type of distributor, whether someone's moving beverages or furniture, right? At the end of the day, their sales model is very similar. So we built a platform customized for that business model.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just personally have noticed that SaaS kind of left this weird dead zone for a lot of these kinds of businesses. You know what I mean? Like there was a lot of SaaS selling to other, tech companies or digital, or enterprise, but then a lot of things that I would consider somewhere in the ballpark of a local / SMB and people who are not super digital techie types. It's like they got left behind and there were no products for them. And then you check in and you're like, how is there no CRM for this kind of thing? Who left these people behind? But I'm curious, given, this is kind of your non-tech sort of audience, what does their typical customer journey look like? How do they find you? How do they kind of build that relationship and sort of move down that pipeline?
The distribution space is interesting. A lot of them are actually most of them are privately held. Huge acquisition space. So like a lot of older industries that have been around for a very long time, it's very relationship driven. So I talk about my digital background, but we do place a high priority on these events because these people are really buying from a human. They're not buying from a vendor, right? So it does take a lot of time to establish ourselves in terms of thought leaders in the space, which has been a lot of our focus over these last few months, is just really pushing ourselves out there in terms of being a leading thought leader on how to actually use AI and data in your business, because this industry is a bit of lagger in terms of them taking on tech besides operations. So they have an amazing foundation in terms of having an ERP in place, but it's actually educating these business leaders of how you need a real tech stack. So when you think about a customer journey, it's a lot of education up front and then kind of taking them through that process. Our sales cycle is at a minimum of 6 months for these larger corporations. And, I'd say that marketing is really part of that, the entire process, right? From bringing in the demand gen, bringing in the interest, helping educate, to then helping them push them down the funnel in terms of getting them to engage in us, whether they meet us at an event or attend a virtual event like a webinar, or we get introduced to them through one of our associations that we're part of. So, once they kind of convert, right, they're sitting with, our sales team for a long time, a lot of demos, a lot of deep dives. Oftentimes they're bringing in a tech role from the company to do a deeper analysis on the Salesforce platform. And then on that point, we have our strongest part of our business model is our actual implementation and customer support. So we really, really try and keep all of our implementation in-house. Obviously, all of our support is in-house. And we really pride ourselves on having like very superior customer support.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess it sounds like events were one of the major like channels in there. And am I missing any other like major channels that these people are kind of going to?
Um, I would say the leaders of these companies, so you're talking C-suite, they're going to be the most active in person at such like, in scenarios like that. But then you actually have to think about the entire committee that surrounds that C-suite, which are the actual end users of the platform. So think about VP of sales, head of operations, any technical admins. So from a demand gen and awareness perspective, we hit the entire like committee surrounding that buying committee and the influencers of them, as well as the buying committee within the C-suite. So events are our arm of getting in touch with the right people. But I actually look at events as like these tent poles that you place along your marketing campaign timelines, where you do a lot of your demand gen and awareness around these big events. So that way, since we're a new company, we've only been in it for 2 years. So that way there is hopefully some awareness about us as we go into these events. So that way we can really, really get a return on our investment. Because as you know, some of the largest marketing budget goes towards these events. So I would say our demand gen and support around that is actually our biggest arm, outside of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So mostly events and then supporting with demand gen kind of like around the events. Is that sort of the right way to think about it?
Yeah, and then you fill all of that in with your content and your media type content, from anything from videos to white papers to feature documentation and things like that. And we do, obviously we're doing PR, we're doing all the things. I would just say when I think about a full marketing strategy, those are your biggest pieces, I'd say, for us at this point in getting our brand out there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like, it's kind of event demand gen around it. It sounds like in some ways you do focus on the event marketing aspect. And I know, before when we were talking, there was also a big emphasis around sort of like there is events, but when you're at, that size, and you're very early on and there's only so many events you can go to and that sort of thing. There's also all the demand gen around it. And I'm just curious, like, sort of the relationship between the two and how those connect. Like, what are the problems, or what are you getting out of most in the events, and then how does that kind of compare to the rest of the demand gen? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And there's another, very important piece to this is our SDR team. So your like inside sales group, right? We have a fairly small one because I think the model is really changing when it comes to selling SaaS, right? So our marketing and sales team is in extreme lockstep because obviously sales is who's going to the event and representing. And so what we've done is we've put a pretty complex MQL model in place. So that way, as we're doing all this awareness and doing a lot of the demand gen work, we're scoring our prospects. So we try and really focus on that outbound that we do ahead of event and post events. We're really focusing our target on the audience that's engaging the most. So that way we have the highest rate of return when we're physically at these events and we're engaging with the right people. We're making the most of our time there. Because we are a small team, because we can only go to so many events, we just want to make sure we're maximizing the engagement when we're physically there. And I think having an appropriate scoring model that is actually, we have multiple scoring models, but we do have one that actually really does look at an engagement before and after an event to help even push that, quality even further.
Yeah. I'm actually curious a little bit about, that scoring model, if you wanted to get into it. Because I've worked with a lot of clients who are like Series A and B, and they're sitting there and they're working on different models. And you know how it is. Like there's a lot of different opinions on how to do the scoring, and sales and marketing sometimes kind of go back and forth. I'm just curious, kind of like how you guys came to that, and then what did you like come to?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, an MQL and scoring model really should be a very flexible, fluid part. I think you always have to start somewhere. Like we started obviously ours from scratch. So we had to get a benchmark and baseline, and then we just constantly measure back on it. So the biggest piece of that is like looking at your conversion rate of MQL to an actual sales lead. So, you can make your best guesses, you can do all of your research out there, but the thing that's missing when you do your research and look at other people's scoring models is they're not in the same industry you are. So what might count as a high score for someone out of the distribution space might be entirely different for my ICP. So we're constantly kind of adjusting and tweaking ours. I think the biggest thing that happened though was from COVID, right? So much of that sales process was happening in person, more on-sites, more on-site demos. So it was kind of hard to actually put a score behind those kind of engagements. Whereas now, so much of the sales process is just happening virtually. So there's a lot of different actually touch points you can score on. And because of COVID and because of how much that kind of flooded, right, the internet, all of our LinkedIn feeds went from like a couple updates a day to now hundreds of updates a day. Just because so I think pre-COVID, it was 7 touch points to remember a brand. Now it's like over 14. It's doubled in the last few years. So I think placing different, priority on different engagement is really the most important part. What we probably back in like, the golden era of selling SaaS, like I'm talking more so like 2013, 2015, well into pre-COVID, you could probably look at an email open, probably not think much of it. You're like, yeah, okay. Now you look at an email open and you're like, wow, finally. So I just think like it's in a constantly evolving scoring model. And those who set one in the beginning and then hold it true, then I would really say you have to look at the actual quality of these conversions. Because the only way that your work in marketing is actually being influential is if it's actually resulting in true leads. And we have a goal, 200 MQLs a quarter, but then we also have a conversion goal on that. And that's just as important of one.
Yeah. So it sounds very much like, adapting early and often to what is actually converting, rather than just like, I defined an MQL and then I'm going to throw it over the wall and it's all going to be good.
Exactly.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like that keeps marketing nice and aligned with, sales, especially early on. And then, sales is kind of doing a whole lot of outreach in advance of the events, obviously at the events and then following up after. I'm curious, like you also mentioned the demand gen that goes into that. I'm curious how that sort of, goes into, through, and out of events, and sort of like what that process looks like as well.
Yeah. So like I said, we do like a ton of awareness leading into event, whether it's aligning with the SDR team and they're targeting a certain particular, set of attendees going, or we're just targeting as a whole, whether it's targeted LinkedIn campaigns, email campaigns, remarketing campaigns through search, through the Google network. So we kind of look at all these different channels of how to do a general higher level awareness, whereas then we let the SDRs take a more selective list, whether that's your C-suite and your buyers that are actually attending, and we kind of surround them. You can think of it in that way. And then obviously you have your engagement happening at the event, and then you have your post follow-up. And a lot of times in these industries, the same people attend all the same events. So at the end of the day, if we're attending an event for the very first time and we haven't been there yet, it's kind of hard to gauge what we're actually going to get out of it. But knowing that we're going to roll into the next event and see some similar faces, changing that engagement going into it. Also, I think a really big thing to call out is when you're a small startup is how you actually engage our C-suite at these events. So not every event am I going to send. I might send a salesperson if we have a booth or we're exhibiting, or I might actually send our founder if it's a different type of event where we're not exhibiting. There's nothing like that going on. It's just more so relationship building and putting my founders as a thought leader, and not just sending Ohanafy, but I'm actually sending Ohanafy CEO, and he has his own brand and representation himself. So I think that's also where marketing plays a role, is trying to understand, like, first of all, what do we actually expect to get out of this event? Let's not pretend we know everything. We're new to this industry, and the right people and the right way we want to engage when we're there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff in there. I guess, one aspect of that is sort of like, how do you build a lot of the awareness and sort of like, what is the process for building that awareness, not just for Ohanafy, but it also sounds like your founding team.
Yeah, so we actually are dabbling in. I mean, I think it's part of our strategy when it comes to content and demand gen perspective. We actually do build founder content behind our CRO and CEO, mainly about kind of the more forward-looking future topics for this industry, which is mainly around data and AI. So a lot of the content we put like out on LinkedIn, for example, that's authored by either one of those. Those are kind of the main topics. So we do newsletters from them. A lot of times we'll kind of go through the process of introducing themselves through in-mails, connecting with people personally that we're seeing or attending these events, and really making them a familiar face for these people. So a lot of it is through social networks, mainly through LinkedIn, as you know. So yeah, I'd say that's probably our most direct way. And we do a lot of video content as well with our founders. They tend to get the most engagement. People like to see a real face. And like I said, at the end of the day, they're not buying just from Ohanafy. They're buying from the people that's building this company. When you buy a tech platform that's going to be a 6-month long implementation and a 5-year contract, you are looking at them as a partner. And a lot of these companies, they don't have a tech. Yeah, they don't have a tech department, right? So they really look at us as kind of like that extended arm of their business, helping them run that part of their business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, firstly, it makes sense that they're really just buying into the founder, the belief in them, the belief in almost like, I don't want to say it's almost like hiring them as part of an extension of their own business. You know what I mean? It's not literally a hire, but it has that kind of feel. Whereas like when you buy, you buy a Snickers or something like that, you're not hiring the Snickers. You know what I mean? Like you're just buying a candy bar. And there are some of those like kinds of sales where it's very transactional, like stuff where you can just go do the free trial, sign up for it, you're good to go. But this is very much more strategic, complex sales where it's like executive to executive level relationships, and just kind of like believing in the people. And so you back that up by creating a lot of thought leadership content. Sounds like primarily on LinkedIn, for your founders, and kind of like backing them up, giving them a lot of like thought leadership, forward looking stuff, that kind of thing. Does that sound right?
Yeah, exactly. And to the point of how we engage in events as well and how marketing does support that, we also look for any opportunity to kind of pitch ourselves and get on, whether it's an opportunity to present at these events, or be part of any other subgroups within these memberships. So a great example is our CRO is actually part of one of the larger wholesaler associations in the US. They have a subcommittee that's just focused on AI. So he's on that committee, for example. So he sits in our meetings, he contributes content, he authors things for that committee, and he's really become the go-to person when they want to talk about AI and data within your sales platform. And then another example is our CEO will be on an innovation panel at one of our events coming up. So it's not just about sitting at a booth
Yeah.
or sitting at the bar at the end of the night and talking about, and giving your pitch, right? So it's really like we don't actually go there to truly sell. We go there to consult. We go there to talk about what we're doing and what we're building. We're not going there to sign a contract
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah. In some ways, it's more like you're setting up your founders to be like pillars in that community, not to pitch to the community. Very, very different angle.
Yeah, and these businesses have been in business for 60, 80 years, right? Like they want that relationship and they're going to take a while, right, to get comfortable and really build that trust.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, it kind of sounds like a lot of it is, thought leadership for the founding team, that sort of thing, and then helping them sort of build themselves up at those events so that they just naturally have the relationships and the network. And then that kind of like works itself out into basically, complex sales and that kind of thing. So
Exactly.
in some ways, like some part of me hears the echoes of like account-based marketing somewhere later down the line. Like I can kind of see how at some point you might or might not be able to send founders to just absolutely everything, you know what I mean? And as the sales team eventually kind of scales, then the question is like, how do you support the sales team doing a very similar role and kind of building that network? And it sounds like it could go down the path of ABM, but like, let me know if I'm insane there.
No, you're correct. I mean, at the end of the day, everything is kind of ABM if you really if you really want to look at that under the demand gen umbrella, right? Because whether you're doing one to one, one to some, or one to many, right now we're in that one to many realm because we're still trying to really pare down who our focus is. But we also want our general brand awareness across them all. So, within the distribution space, you can really start to segment by essentially their revenue, whether they're more on the craft end or whether they're big distributors that are supporting the Molson Coors and the Constellation brands of the country. So we are already doing a slightly ABM approach. But yes, as we go forward and as we really start to navigate these larger enterprise deals, we will definitely move into that motion. But that doesn't mean we won't continue to do this general, high level awareness that we're doing across the entire industry. But when it comes to like event selection or very highly focused and targeted campaigns where you're building, for example, a resource center that was just built for this one distribution prospect, where they hit this landing page and their logo is on top, and you talk about the partnership we can have together, and you build resources out specific to their business model and the brands that they're selling and things like that. That's when you just get super targeted because the potential revenue out of these deals could be very, influential for a company at our size. In my previous role, we didn't start doing ABM until years into the business because I think it does take some time to really define and get the sales team aligned with that. But I actually see a lot of potential doing that early on while we're small, while our marketing and sales team is so close in what we're doing. It will just make that motion easier to build and get started now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that it sounds kind of like that's one of the main things is just while you're small, that has sort of defined a lot of the things that you can do and then like where to prioritize your time. Would that be the biggest thing that sort of determines your marketing right now? It's just like where you are in terms of size and scale and that kind of thing?
Exactly. And one to mention in that list is budget, right? So we've got investors. We haven't done a Series A yet. I have investors to answer to. Why we just spend X on this event, whatever it may be. So I think it's constant, what I like to call is ruthless prioritization. And at the end of the day, at this size, everything we do really needs to focus on supporting that revenue model. And how are we generating leads? How are we helping push deals forward? So I think that's why when I came in, I saw the need to start a demand gen motion very early on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So like main problem being like you don't have that much budget and you need to know that it is driving something. How do you like ruthlessly prioritize? I'm curious, like how did you go through the journey of finding that really the things to prioritize were sort of like events and demand gen, as opposed to like someone might think of something else. They might have some favorite channel that they liked or they knew how to work. You kind of zeroed in on these couple. Like what led you to that?
I'd say it was a combination of looking at tools available to us with a small team, as well as as well as testing, right? So, for example, we have a PR firm, but I really look at when you have a small marketing team, what can you outsource and what can you turn on and off easily? If I hired someone internally just to run PR and all of a sudden Q3 rolls around, for example, we don't hit our number and I'm looking at how I can slim down budget. You never want to be in this scenario where you're looking at headcount as a way to slim down your overhead. So I look at that agency support. So we did some PR at the beginning of this year as we were really breaking into this new space. We took a lot from them. We came up with a content model with them. We got a lot out of it. And then I paused them for the next 3 months because we got so much from it. We could then pull that in-house and continue to use that on our own. So that's a great example of how you can kind of prioritize, hey, I know we need to do this, but PR doesn't necessarily mean we're filling pipeline, but we know we need to do it. So how can we get support from it and then really like get a lot out of it and use my internal team to really maximize it, as well as looking at different tools within the marketing space to support you. So when it comes to content, I remember, a few years when I first started at Encino, we had multiple people dedicated just to content. I mean, when you're selling these very complex platforms that are built on Salesforce, you really need to go into that education piece and really educate on what the technology actually does from a product standpoint and feature ability. But nowadays, I have one content person, and because you have different tools like AI that's helping knock out this content, and because we're, like I said, we're small, there's actually a lot of agile practice in that where they can literally walk over to the product team and say, okay, tell me about these new features. They spit out a bunch of technical jargon. My marketing content person goes back and can create stuff very quickly because we do have supporting tools like AI content supporting tools. And then additionally, just investing in the right tech from the start. So I worked on multiple different marketing automation platforms, and I knew going into this role, I wanted to be a HubSpot shop. Just knowing that we are getting a really strong partnership out of HubSpot, and the way they have really evolved their marketing platform, it's kind of the best on the market, in my opinion, right now. So investing in that tool early on and getting the most out of it. So it's kind of a combination of tools and really looking at your people and not saying, hey, I'm hiring you just for this. I'm going to hire you for multiple things, but you're going to have the support from a lot more tools and tech because we're investing in that part early.
Yeah. So it sounds like a little bit of it is figuring out like what things that you can sort of outsource to an agency that's a little cheaper than a full, headcount, as well as like taking the headcount you have and seeing how much you can maximize them with a lot of these tools, like a lot of AI these days. And just like recently, to just sort of support your point there, I was talking to a former client of mine. We have a very good relationship. And he's like, yeah, man, I mean, there's just so much you can do now with AI and offshoring. There is like an incredible amount of work that you can do that before you could not really do. And it's like when you are in that situation, if you're, seeing your pre-series A and you don't have that kind of budget, in some ways it's like a good time right now between all the tools that are out there and the AI and some of the agencies and some of the like offshoring you can do. You can get a crazy amount done despite a very low budget, and like kind of really squeeze that budget for a lot. And that kind of sounds like the main thing that you've been, getting to, as well as using the right tools that you're going to invest in, you're going to be using going forward, like HubSpot.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense in terms of sort of like addressing that problem of like, hey, we only have so much budget. How do we get some, the most results for it? And it sounded like your second prong to that was also a lot of testing. And I'm assuming that's sort of like figuring out what you did get out of that amount of budget and then sort of how to move forward. I'm just curious, like sort of what is your thought process going through that?
Yeah, I would say the most we've tested in that we for the first time did this year, all these associations we join. So within our space, there's a lot of, because they do have to really advocate for their position within the supply chain. They are a lot of like state level associations as well as national associations that a lot of these business leaders are involved in. So there's obviously ways as a supporting partner we can get involved. So we've kind of selected some of our target areas geographically to invest in being members of these associations and really utilizing those partnerships to do as much as we can with them and getting in front of their attendees and engaging in their hosted webinars. So I'd say when it comes to like us testing where to invest our budget, I kind of looked at these associations that are also very aligned with these events of how can we partner with them and then essentially use them as an extension of our awareness and their channels. Because these associations have been around for a very long time. They're our trusted space for these business, owners to go to and get advice and get consulted on of other, tech vendors that they might want to consider. So there's been a lot of testing there. Whether it's something you want to pay for an e-blast through their membership or you want to pay to host a webinar, whatever it may be. So that was something kind of new to me in this space. And so far, there's been a really good return on it, especially if you think about it, when one contract is a 6-figure contract and we may have paid $2,000 to host a webinar. I mean, clearly there's an amazing return on that. So I think that's also something to note as someone in a marketing role. It's understanding what channel and what activities is going to result in getting in front of what type of ICP. So when we do these demand gen campaigns where we're sending emails and things like that, which obviously is extremely low cost, we're not worried nearly as much about the spend and return on that versus investing a couple $1,000s into a e-blast or a webinar or an article that we're paid for, but we know the audience that that's going in front of is a very focused audience and the buyer we want to be in front of. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So a lot of, measuring ROI, it sounds like, and really knowing which ICP you're going after with that campaign. Does that sound right?
exactly. And which channel, right? The VP of sales or literally the guy on the truck delivering the product versus the CEO. They're not engaging in the same channels. So you have to actually find where your people are engaging and who you're trying to target.
Yeah, in my own little mental model, I kind of think of that as like, how much money do you put in? What channel does it go through? And then what ICP does it reach on the other side, if that kind of makes sense.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And those are like, I kind of look at marketing as I've always in my head, like a layered cake. You have your top level brand awareness. I call them my evergreen campaigns. Think about that as your Google search, your G2 reviews, your profiles out there aligned, your website, making sure everything that is aligned, and that's running constantly, right? That's your SEO and that's your SEM constantly running. And then the next layer below that is your demand gen. And your demand gen is still quite large audiences, like I spoke about, that one to many, but they're starting to get more segmented. They're getting segmented a little bit more by channel. What are you hitting in your social channels? What are you hitting in your email marketing? What are you hitting in your virtual events? What are you hitting in your in-person events? And those are starting to get more segmented by probably industry, like the actual business type, or maybe how large they are in revenue. And then the next layer below that is when you really start getting into your personas. So how are we going to actually look at that and then focus in, okay, here are our C-suite, here's your buying committee, and here's your supporting buying committee. And then how are we going to engage with them even more particularly and create content and engagement that's very specific to their role. So that's kind of how I've always seen it. And then how do you allocate budget across that equally or not equally, depending on what the goal is that quarter, that year, right? So back to my favorite word, flexibility and ruthless prioritization.
That is a lot, I think, for good, like, early stage startups, because the thing is, at that stage, you don't really know anything. And I almost fear the founders who think that they do. You know what I mean? Because that's startups. It's like, we don't know what's going to work until we've tried it. And so, yeah, absolutely, like, flexibility, it's that adaptability, the agility, and then sort of, just testing it, measuring it, seeing what ROI came out of it, and then prioritizing that versus everything else. It looked like you were going to add something there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think that really comes back to your people. So we are a very young leadership team. We have a young founding team, but all of us have been in a startup at some point in our careers before doing this one. And I think we learned the good and, the good and bad, the things that worked and didn't work. And I think we were all able to bring that thought and mentality into this and understanding that it is okay to take risks. It's okay when we fail, as long as we measure it and then we tweak it or we change it going forward, because none of us pretend to know everything and we don't know everything. I mean, I think we would fail very quickly if we acted that way. So that really comes down to a culture perspective and that what you're actually trying to cultivate across your organization. And that comes from the top down.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I've worked with a lot of different startups, and just personally, I kind of like survey the different, CMOs and VPs of marketing I've worked with, and sometimes the founding team. It's like clear that, a lot of CMOs and VPs, they have like strong personalities and strong opinions on things like that, which I think is like a strength to some degree, is that you have that force of will and a certain strength of like opinion on things that you can sort of drive people in that direction and set that vision in that direction. But sometimes one of the things that I find interesting is sort of comparing the clients that I think are, growing like gangbusters versus the clients I've seen where I'm like, I don't know how far they're going to go. You know what I mean? Like, and that's obviously something I usually kind of keep in my head. But there are patterns to it, like you see enough startups. From what I've seen, the startups that I kind of question have like founding or executive members who don't just have a strong opinion, but it's also taken as fact. Like, they just know that this thing is the way that it is. And, maybe they're right. Maybe they're very smart individuals and they're very experienced, but what will kill them is when they have an assumption that this thing is just a God-given fact and it's not. And then they don't have the adaptability to like adapt to that situation. Whereas like all the best founders and executives I've known, they may openly admit that they just don't know the thing, which kind of like sounds weak in a meeting, you know what I mean? But on the other hand, it's because they recognize like they don't know the thing. It requires experimentation. They look at the results and they're willing to learn from it. That means that they have growth and that they can kind of like adapt forward into that situation. And so I actually have a lot more faith in that, even though it may not like sound super assertive and confident in a meeting. But I usually see that that kind of culture is what makes the right people. And then from there, even if they make the wrong decisions today, they learn from it and they start making better decisions tomorrow. And then they're making some of the best decisions, a couple of years time. And they really know the space very well because of that kind of culture. But yeah, that's just like a random aside from me. I don't know if that like resonates or if you have anything on that.
Yeah, I think I do think too, when it comes to those early years in a startup, speed is your weapon. And I think that can sometimes be a double-edged sword because you think you have to move so fast, decide so fast, you don't feel like you have the time to experiment. But I actually challenge that way of thinking because if you really think about something, if you don't experiment and understand what's really working, and then you go down a path and it ends up failing, you could have pivoted and you could have made a better decision actually a lot sooner. So I think it's a bit of a younger mentality of just because we do something and just because we experiment on it doesn't mean it needs to stay within our plan, right, of attack. Like, let's all be modest enough to understand when we fail and to say, yep, we tried it, didn't work. Doesn't mean we need to stick with it just because we said we would. So I think at the end of the day, it actually allows you to move even faster because I've been in scenarios where you just make a decision with not a ton of reasoning behind it. And then all of a sudden you're 6 months, a year down the road and you're not getting the results out of it because you didn't have that trial period where you're like, okay, is this actually what we need to do here?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And in some ways, it kind of comes back to what you were saying before about, that flexibility and, being able to sort of turn things on and off. I'm curious, kind of coming back to that whole, central problem around, you only have so much, you need to move fast and you only have so much budget. That's kind of like the central problem of being a startup in a way is like, I want to grow fast, but I only have this much. And you had a few tactics, I think you were talking about between agencies, AI, and tools and things like that. And I'd love to sort of dig into details around each of those and sort of see like what your methodology is, just so that other people might be able to learn from that and sort of think, hey, is there something I could be doing with agencies or something I could be doing with AI or tools I should be investing in, and sort of like give them some brass tacks on what they could do. So I don't know if you have like a certain methodology or a process to that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah, it's funny because my brain can go in a bunch of different directions with that. But I actually think about the use of tools and a clean process internally and letting that be your foundation that you then build on top of. So if your house is not in order, it's going to be hard to bring on an agency. So at the end of the day, making sure that everyone within your marketing and revenue organization and the company as a whole understands your brand, your purpose, and what you're selling and your product. Because everyone needs to be in lockstep. So that way, when my in-house person is managing our PR relationship, I know she's singing from the same song sheet as my SDR person and their email outbound. Just making sure everyone across the board is saying the same thing and representing the brand in the same way. So that's what I mean by having your house in order. And to even double click on that, it's actually a lot of organization from like a tool and resource perspective. So how are you updating your sales team on your recent content? How are you sharing your changes and evolutions in your messaging? So we do a lot of alignment meetings. We're not like a crazy weekly, we don't need that. But I'd say at least once a month, we pull together the sales team and the marketing team and we sit down and we align what's working, what's not working. What have we updated? How do we want to talk about this piece of the product? What has changed in the product? What does now need to reflect in marketing collateral and sales collateral? So I'd say that constant alignment and doing it frequently, because that, to your point, like things do move very fast, things change often. So that alignment needs to happen quite frequently. Another more tactful example is your communication tools internally. So obviously we're Slack shop, but we also like eat our own dog food. So we are also Salesforce internally. So we make sure all of our tools are connected well. So I'd say our three main things is like the way our HubSpot instance, the way our Slack communication, and then the way our sales team engages within our leads within Salesforce. So whatever CRM you're using, making sure that what your marketing team is running their campaigns out of, and then what your sales team is using to then engage, track, and push them through the sales funnel, that they actually have a clear view of all those touch points. A lot of times a lead gets passed to sales doesn't see all the things that happened to make that person become a lead. Whereas I made sure that when a lead flowed through HubSpot, hits your communication channel, whether that's an engagement in Slack internally or whether that's a notification out of your CRM. And then as it gets pushed into your sales tool, making sure that your sales team has access to all of the pieces of collateral and touch points that lead went through. So however that looks like for another organization, for us particularly, it's activities in HubSpot. So if I go to a contact record in HubSpot that just MQL'd, I can see every point that made them MQL. I can see every email they opened. I can see every landing page they went to. So as the SDR, when I pick up my phone and call this person for the first time, I'm going to have a very educated conversation on what they're already interested in. So my cold call all of a sudden is no longer a cold call. So for us, all that information flows in. It actually hits an internal Slack channel. So they see it right away because we know how quick you need to be on those things. And then from there, the sales team will pick it up and put it into our CRM tool, which is Salesforce. And then that's where we run the sales process out of.
That makes a lot of sense. So the main emphasis I'm hearing, though, is like a lot of internal alignment, and not just, on, some branding stuff, but also strongly between marketing and sales, which I feel like at that size, you can really get marketing and sales to get in the same room on a lot of things. And then starting from extremely like good alignment there before you start going into, agencies and that kind of stuff.
Exactly, because it's all part of the same funnel. So when we say, for example, a real situation is we use an association and we run a webinar that's hosted by a state association in the beer wholesale. Here's an example. We do the webinar, we get the attendee list, we see who engages in the webinar, we see who attends, we run that list into our HubSpot. Marketing then runs at that list. We do the follow-up. We send the recording back after. We watch the engagement happen. Then all of a sudden we get these conversions coming out of it. That initial touch point was said webinar. Said webinar cost $2,000, let's say. Sales team picks that up. They see how they engage. They convert them to lead. Literally, I can then look at that lead list and say, okay, this event cost us $2,000 and we get X amount of leads out of it. We already know our return. So kind of closing the loop on our conversation, right? Like that also comes back to extreme testing and understanding the return on your spend. And that's what I mean by like alignment, because if you don't have your house in order and your process in order, scaling and getting a larger team and a large SDR team will be very difficult to teach that, unless you already have a process like that in place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So really, you have to set that all up before you start talking about trying to scale. Like you need the foundation before you can build stuff on top of it. If you don't have a good foundation, you start adding the agencies and doing all this other stuff, like, well, what is it that they're really doing? And, are they aligned with the rest of the whole process?
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I guess kind of digging deeper on that, is there anything where you've seen like other organizations where it's just clear alignment didn't happen or something like that? For me, thinking from my own perspective, I've worked for a few startups where, they got their big, Series B or something like that. And there was a culture of like, oh, we have money. We need to just start hiring people left, right, and center, especially engineers. I don't know what it is, but it's that San Francisco, Silicon Valley culture of like, hey, we got a bunch of VC money, spend it fast. And they were like, they were hiring every engineer who looked reasonably competent. And they were just like, there was a goal to triple headcount. And I didn't understand why. And now at the time I was like a younger person, I was just a specialist. So maybe there was more wisdom behind it than I knew, but it kind of just sounded like triple headcount for the sake of tripling headcount as though that's a metric of growth. And the problem that I saw there was kind of like, well, basically, I don't even know what the process is in the organization is right now, but we're going to triple that. Whatever that is, we're going to triple it. And so I've like seen situations where people started scaling, but kind of like what you're saying, they didn't necessarily have that, upfront foundation, that alignment, knowing what they were doing, but they were, whatever they were doing, they were scaling it. You know what I mean? I'm curious, like, if you have any tips or pointers around that of like things that you've seen go wrong, if you will, and then sort of like better practices.
Yeah, I mean, I experienced that as well in my previous company, the grow at all costs, where you do big funding round, and then all of a sudden you just need to then answer for all that influx of resources. And that means dumping money into marketing, dumping money into product, dumping money into the sales team. I'd say the biggest hindrance I've seen out of that quick of growth is misalignment across the organization. So all of a sudden you have product building X, Y, and Z. It's not aligned with what sales is actually selling. Then marketing is torn between the two, and then all of a sudden the overlook, like the high level company goals are all of a sudden very muddy and no one really understands what they're marching towards. And as soon as you have employees lose the sense of trust of what is our overall goal here, that's when you start to harvest a culture of what am I actually contributing to? And I think when you start small and then all of a sudden triple your employee size in 6 months, you want to still keep that startup culture. And the biggest thing that I think contributes to a startup culture, it's not ping pong, it's not snacks, and it's not a cool office. It is that everyone feels like they're contributing to the success of the organization at the time. And that's what keeps people engaged and working the long hours and committing their lives to it for a few years, which I'm sure anyone in an environment like that would laugh.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's making sure that as you scale, especially the leadership team really takes it on their shoulders to make sure it's still extremely clear what we're all working for and the way each department is contributing to that goal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that I think that's very powerful because, you were saying like people starting to wonder whether or not they're actually doing anything. I definitely, I was in that position before where I was kind of like, who are all these people? What are they all doing? What am I doing? And there was even like questions of like, who are the managers? Like who reports to whom? What is happening? And it's sort of like, it kind of does take the wind out of your sails. Cause like the best part about being in a startup is like, that you're working long hours. You know that in some places you might be, paid a little bit less. But on the other hand, like what comes out of it all is that you're not working at, like one of these really large organizations where people can just like crawl into a cubicle and, like basically just live in the cubicle and you don't know what they do. And they might not know what they do, but they have a job. It's a very different culture. Whereas in startups, like, yeah, it's tough, it's a lot of hours, but that everything you do has like a very direct impact. It creates real growth. Like your work matters and you matter. You know what I mean? Like to me, that's one of the best parts of startups rather than just being like another one in the thousands of cubicles in a giant cubicle farm. It's a very different culture. And that's why people, come here. So it's kind of an interesting thing that you raised that if everyone still has good organization, good alignment, they know what they're contributing towards, it kind of keeps that startup culture and it keeps people motivated to keep doing what they're doing. That makes a lot of sense and it really resonates. But I'm curious, like sort of a little bit of you've kind of explained how you do that, especially between marketing and sales, which I think is important because I've definitely seen there be a marketing department just go off in its own direction, and then there be a sales department and decided to go into its own direction, and somehow there was like a magical handoff in between, but no one was super clear on it. And I think you've kind of talked a little bit about that. Once you have the alignment that you've sort of created, how do you go about sort of scaling it, or rather using the budget that's within your means to sort of like use that as efficiently as possible? So you're kind of talking about various tools and AI and that kind of thing. I'm curious, like how do you leverage your alignment into that?
Yeah. I mean, it's extreme feedback, right? So every time we run a campaign or every time we send someone to an event, we're really big on making sure there's kind of these alignment sessions where they can provide feedback directly. Every time we run campaigns, well, obviously they were running them out of HubSpot, but they do end up in our CRM and Salesforce. And every time a campaign wraps up, there's actually an area where a sales rep or a marketing member can go in and give feedback on what they felt worked well or didn't work well. And that way we have like this one place, single source of truth to look at internally of like how things are performing. So that way, when we go back and do our Q1 review, Q2 review, we actually have a place to look at, and it's not just numbers. You can, obviously that's super important. We have our high level department goals, how many MQLs, what's our conversion rates, how many deals are closing that marketing's actually helped influence. Like we look at all those numbers, but then we take it a level deeper where we actually get feedback and we talk through, because at the end of the day, you can only measure so much from a marketing impact standpoint. So I want to sit down with my sales rep, my AE that just came back from an event. And I'm like, tell me who was there. Tell me, were they the right people? The conversations did you have? Did anyone know who we were yet? Like when people came by the booth, were they like, oh, I think I've heard of them? Or did they sit there and say, I know who Salesforce is? And then I take that feedback back and I say, okay, next time we head to an event, Salesforce is going to be, their logo is going to be in our banner, because everyone knows Salesforce at this point. Like it's little things like that you're not going to get feedback through a number.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. So feedback early and often, and it sounds like from everybody, even on those qualitative things that are not going to show up in your typical metrics.
Exactly. Yes. And having a place for it all to sit, because we've all been there and done that, where you're meeting to meeting every day and you get Slack messages and you get emails and all these different things are coming at you throughout the day and all these different communication channels. So we really try and keep everything with the sales and marketing organization in the same place.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, overall, a lot of sort of what I've been hearing is flexibility, testing, feedback, and a lot of just like listening to the feedback and the results of things and really being grounded in the actual results, not just an internal sense of motion or something like that.
Exactly.
I'm curious overall, like, have you had any like really good stories or any really like great results, or great numbers that kind of came out of that, like a big win, if you will?
I would say our biggest wins happening right now is becoming the AI spokespeople, if so you will, within the beer distribution space. So by getting our CRO involved in that subcommittee, all of our PR focus this year has not been about Ohanafy and product growth and what we're doing. It's really been about how we think AI and data analysis needs to support the distribution space in the next 5 years. So we really took our content strategy and really pushed on that. And now I get calls, which is rare. I get calls from associations saying, hey, we have this speaking engagement and we need someone to talk about AI and distribution. And we thought of you guys. So not necessarily sitting here and saying we closed a deal off of it, but I consider that a huge win, because we're in this for the long haul. And I have the understanding that, yes, we want to contribute it to pipeline. We want to be able to really support that. But at the end of the day, I'm also thinking about the 5-10 years from now and being a truly trusted partner in this space. So there's been a lot of really wonderful momentum out of that. I will also say one of our bigger successes is, as we've broken into this new distribution space, really understanding the segments and getting more particular with our messaging. And we're seeing our open rates above 40% right now, which I think any marketer would kind of like, what? How? And I think it has a lot to do with just the way we're engaging with them and the way we're positioning ourselves and the way we're not selling ourselves off the bat.
Yeah. And in some ways, what I hear in that is like, for a company that's very, very young, you're actually really building some solid relationships and kind of building that network where people see you as a real authority to go to. Because it'd be very easy for these companies who have been around, like you're saying, 60, 80 years, and see this, young, tech company that's already been around for like a couple of years and be like, oh, they're just some punk kids, and yet they're coming to you and they're like seeing you as a resource and an authority. I mean, that's a pretty big deal for such a small and such a young company.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, we are growing from a customer acquisition immensely, but as you know, I am very big on, when you put a customer out there as your spokesperson, that means anyone can pick up the phone at any time, get that person on the phone and say, tell me about Ohanafy. Tell me your experience. So I'm very strategic on like who we announce as customers, because I want to make sure we have our best foot forward in that way. So until we have that really strong customer advocacy program, which I think you understand, that takes years to build, especially when you have implementation process that takes 6 months. We're a 2-year company. We're just rolling off some of our first implementations this year. So that does take a long time to build. So as we gain momentum in that space, I'm also focusing on how do we build trust. And that is, to me, on being like the tech leader in terms of understanding the future of the industry and being a voice of reason in that sense.
Yeah, yeah. In many ways, it sounds great because it's like you have a very strategic way of looking at it. I've worked with a lot of like companies that go after SMB, and it's very transactional, and they're like, "Hey, I'm just hawking my stuff." And here you have like a very long view, a 5-year view on how you're going to build up, Ohanafy as sort of a whole resource in the relationship, and a resource in the network and the community, and then not worrying too much about like, hey, can we slap a logo on the website? Because I've heard that one before. They're like, oh, we dropped our pants. We did whatever we could do just to make sure we get this customer and put their logo on the website. And then behind the scenes, they're like really unhappy customers. And like, I've
Yep.
heard of this kind of thing, but you're coming from a very like strategic perspective on it. Yeah. Does that sort of
Yes.
sound right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I guess just for the sake of curiosity, you have some wins there, and sort of like the things that have been working well. I'm just curious if you had anything that like didn't work as well, or you just saw something and were like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. You know what I mean?
I would say the one thing, not necessarily that it hasn't worked well, it's just we haven't started it, and I'm feeling the need to start it. One of our biggest differentiators in our space to our competitors is how often we product release and how often we update and innovate on our product. So I'm actually seeing an opportunity from a white space of how we can also own that kind of messaging of how your tech partner needs to actually take your feedback and build it back into the product, which we truly do. So now I'm already thinking like, how do we weave that into our content strategy from a marketing perspective? How do we actually start branding our releases? How do we get release updates out there that's some meant for customers, obviously, because they're way more in the weeds, versus what can we just put out there from a product update through a PR lens to let people know how much we're innovating. So I'd say not necessarily didn't work. It's just something I'm seeing like, okay, this is something we need to get on.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of comes back to the whole part where you guys are very flexible, you're getting a lot of feedback, and you can sort of almost like have that manifest out into the messaging and saying, hey, your tech partner needs to be flexible, your tech partner needs to be taking your feedback moving forward. And then you can kind of alley-oop that into saying like, hey, this is how they should be growing with you over the next 5 years as AI takes over, and you can see the technology beginning to advance the things that you do. Well, that comes from having a tech partner who moves quickly, over those next 5 years and is a strategic partner. So yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of good stuff in that space. And in some ways it sounds like it's a symptom of all the things you're already doing. So it's easy to market, rather than like
Exactly.
marketing it first and then figuring out how to do it later.
And then it not happening. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I guess, is there anything else, like any like big main lesson you'd want to sort of like pass forward to other people, or anything that they could sort of learn from or implement themselves?
I would say, from a career perspective, once again, like that mentorship and really connecting with other people in your industry in marketing roles to understand what's working, what's not. We talked a lot about testing internally and looking at your own data, but sometimes it takes a long time to build that. So there's no harm in trying to find networks and other CMOs or other VPs of marketing who are trying similar things and getting, insights from them and what's working. So to me, that's just like growing your own personal network and just maximizing your skill set within your employees. I try and reassess constantly my team, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying, because typically people are going to excel in the work that they're enjoying versus not. And just because you put someone in this bucket and you hired them for this, the amount of times I've seen someone actually work better in a different role or with different tasks, maybe they're better at project management versus writing content or whatever it may be. I think really being flexible in terms of your resources and your skills. And when I say resources, that doesn't mean just budget. That doesn't mean just, what you have in terms of agency support. It's actually your people, which is your most important resource.
Yeah. Yes. It sounds like a little bit of, your own community, your own networking, your own like mentoring, but then simultaneously mentoring the people below you and sort of seeing what they can kind of grow into, recognizing that they're kind of the heart and soul of your team. They're the backbone of a lot of everything. So getting mentored and doing mentoring on both sides, it sounds like.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, really quickly, is there anywhere where people can find you or your company?
Yeah, obviously the World Wide Web, Ohanafy.com. But I would say, honestly, our most authentic and engaging content is going to be on our social networks, whether it's on LinkedIn. We do post very regularly on our website from a resource perspective, different blog articles, different thought leadership pieces, and white papers. So if anything, anybody out there is actually really interested on like a B2B model in the Salesforce ecosystem, I'd say we're definitely a good resource for learning more about that as well.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess anything else you want to share or anything you'd want to highlight with Ohanafy?
I think we're good. I feel like we covered a lot, and I really appreciate our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again for being on the show. And love having you.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it, Lee.
Yep. That was Kirsten Kalsky, CMO of Ohanafy. You can find her and Ohanafy at ohanafy.com. That's OHANAFY.com or on LinkedIn. And I'm your host, Lee Cooper. It takes us a long time to put together these podcasts, so we'd love it if you only took a few seconds to rate and review this episode on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if anything really stood out to you, tell me whatever you liked most or least about this episode at lee@cooper-marketing.com. And I'll see you next time.